Alright guys, so in the previous video we talked about some introductory material in photosynthesis. We talked about where photosynthesis occurs. Obviously it happens in the leaves, but more specifically in the chloroplasts. And within the chloroplast there is a special structure called the thylakoid, and that is the active site of photosynthesis, the photosynthetic process. Now, I've mentioned that we're going to start to talk about some details and how within that thylakoid a photosynthetic pigment called chlorophyll A will actually help to harness the photons of light from the sun and energize electrons and eventually put those high energy electrons into sugar molecules. And so we're going to talk about that today. The first thing that we're going to start talking about in this video is something known as the light reactions. And they are called the light reactions because they need the sun's light to actually occur. Now, the light reactions are the first phase of a two-phase process for creating sugar molecules in photosynthesis. The first phase is called the light reactions, and the second phase is called the dark reactions, or the Calvin cycle. Okay? So the first phase that we're going to talk about is the light reactions, and one of the first things we have to understand within the light reactions is that there has to be a transfer of energy to the electrons from the sun's light. Okay? So the transfer of energy to the electrons and from the electrons to the primary electron acceptor is the first step of these light reactions. And so some of this is incorporating, I've started to incorporate some of the structures that we're going to see within the thylakoid membrane that are absolutely important to this transfer of the sun's light, or this transfer of the energy from the sun's light to these electrons. And this happens in something called a photosystem. Specifically, it happens in two photosystems that are embedded in the thylakoid membrane. Now, in each one of these photosystems, they're named photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. And they do come in that order. There's a reason for it. I mean, we don't need to get into it. If you really want to know, you can ask in class. But there's a reason for it, but we call photosystem 2. Photosystem 2 comes first in this process, and photosystem 1 comes second in this process. And this will make more sense when you see some of the diagrams. But each one of these photosystems really likes to absorb wavelengths of light in very specific wavelengths, okay? Very specific nanometer wavelengths. So photosystem 2 likes to absorb photons of light that have a wavelength of 680 nanometers. And photosystem 1 likes to absorb wavelengths of light that are photons of light that are a wavelength of about 700 nanometers. Now, you probably ask, okay, you've talked about photosystems and you say they're important. What the heck is a photosystem? Okay, so a photosystem is a protein complex, and you see a picture of it right in front of you here. Oftentimes they're depicted as big purple blobs. I think this looks like a purple bell pepper to me. But this is a big protein complex that we see here. And embedded in this photosystem are chlorophyll A molecules. That's what we see here. Here's a specialized chlorophyll A molecule and some other chlorophylls. Okay? These pigment molecules we see here in green also specialize in harvesting the light energy of the sun. And so we see these pigment molecules embedded throughout this larger protein complex. Okay? In the center of this, we see something called the reaction center. Okay, the reaction center has something embedded in it called the primary electron acceptor, which is also important. Okay, this entire protein complex called the photosystem is absolutely necessary for harvesting photons of light from the sun. Okay, so when I talk about photosystems, that is what I'm talking about, and that's what you should envision in your head as you try to memorize this process of light capturing. Okay, and so these photosystems, these protein complexes, are embedded in the thylakoid membrane, and we see the thylakoid membrane off here to the side. Okay, it looks very similar, almost identical to the cell membrane. It's made of phospholipids. Okay, with the little tails in the middle and the hydrophilic heads on the outside, very, very similar. And on the inside of the thylakoid, we see the thylakoid space. That's this kind of mint green area down here. Okay, so that's where this happens. That's where the magic happens, as they say. The active site of photosynthesis is in the photosystem on the thylakoid membrane. Okay, so now we have some context for all of this anatomy of a leaf stuff that we've been talking about, and we can kind of visualize now where this will happen. And I think that's a very important part of understanding this process, is the visualization of the process and where it actually happens. Okay, so here we have an idealized picture of the first photosystem. Okay, the first photosystem that is interacted with is photosystem 2. Obviously, this one doesn't look exactly like the picture we see here, but we have to simplify it, because any way we can simplify this process is going to be better for us. Okay. Now I'm going to attempt to break down events that happen in each one of these photosystems, and then kind of bring the whole process together at the end. Okay. So I'm going to, when need be, I'm going to take an opportunity to draw on the screen, and I think I'll take my first opportunity here to talk about exactly what it is that happens in this first photosystem. Okay, so in this process, photosystem 2 comes first. It is the first photosystem that is interacted with by light and electrons. Okay. So we've talked about the first phase, the light reactions of photosynthesis, incorporating electrons, right? And we've talked about the energizing of these electrons to make them mighty, to give them energy, to give them power, because eventually we're going to put them into sugar, right? So that's what we're going to start to talk about here. But to understand how we energize electrons, we have to understand where we get electrons, right? Well, that is fun and interesting, because it's the reason we have to water plants, right? Plants need water because water is the source of the electrons that are going to be energized. Okay? Isn't that interesting? And so that's what we see happen here in this first step. It says number 3 by it, but I like to teach it with this as the first step, because we can break down water. There's an enzyme that will break down water in the plants, and when it breaks down water, this the water basically donates its electrons, and those electrons enter this molecule here. This is chlorophyll A. This is one of the chlorophyll A molecules. And so those low energy electrons are going to enter this chlorophyll A that we see right here. They're just going to sit there for a while. Okay? The byproduct of this breakdown of water is oxygen. And lo and behold, that's where we see our byproduct of oxygen from plants, or from photosynthesis, right? We all know that plants produce the oxygen that we breathe, and that's where it comes from. The breakdown of that water to produce the electrons yields a byproduct of oxygen. Okay? So let me clear all this, erase the ink. So at this point here, let me get a different color. At this point here, we have electrons that are sitting in this chlorophyll A. Okay, that's what we see right there. Now those low energy electrons sit in that chlorophyll A until this light energy right here enters, okay? And those photons of light are harvested by these pigment molecules, okay? And those photons of light bounce through the different pigment molecules until they eventually reach the electrons, okay? And so those photons of light from the sun have a lot of energy. That energy is going to be imparted to the electrons. And so here we can start to talk about a little bit of chemistry. And if we were in class, I would be asking you guys questions. All right, hey, and I might ask these questions in our live sessions, but hey, what happens when you energize electrons? What happens when you have I'll draw it off to the side here. What happens when you have here's the nucleus of an atom. You've got these electrons that are hanging out here. What happens when you give them extra energy? and you would say, okay, this thing's got this energy level that it sits in. When I provide it some energy, it's going to be bumped up to the next energy level, right? And so that's effectively what's happening here. The photons of light are bumping these electrons up to a higher energy state, okay? Now, what happens normally, okay, in a normal chemistry type example, I would then ask you, okay, what happens then to this electron? This electron's been bumped up to a higher energy state. If you know your chemistry, you then say, all right, so then the next thing that happens is it doesn't stay there forever. It loses that energy and falls back down to what we know to be called the ground state, right? And so the electron falls back to the ground state, and as a result, it releases that energy to the atmosphere, okay? And in this case, these photons of light will actually excite those electrons to a higher energy state, and those electrons are held there in the primary electron acceptor, okay? That's the difference between what's happening here in just regular chemistry and what's happening here in photosynthesis. In regular chemistry, those electrons, they'll fall back down into that lower energy state. Here, they're held there for a time until that energy can be harnessed a little bit, okay? All right, so that's what we see happen here in photosystem 2. We see the excitation of electrons that are held in a low energy state in chlorophyll A, and then when they become excited, they're held in what's called the primary electron acceptor in a higher energy state. All right, let's go on to the next stage of this process. Okay, the next stage of this process has us harness. Oh, that's weird. Okay, let's go here. Has us harness the energy associated with these now high energy electrons. In the previous step, we had talked about the photons of light exciting these electrons here to a higher energy state. They are held in that higher energy state by the primary electron acceptor. At this point, these electrons are passed through an electron transport chain. Okay, and this works almost identically in nature to what we see in the mitochondria. In the mitochondria, we pass high energy electrons from sugar, right, to the electron transport chain. They worked their way through the electron transport chain. They pumped H plus to the other side of the mitochondrial membrane. That H plus flowed back down along its concentration gradient, spun this thing in ATP synthase, and then ATP synthase made ATP. That is the exact same process that happens right here. These high energy electrons are passed through this electron transport chain. The energy associated with those electrons is harvested, and ATP is made as a result. This is like free ATP, right? Because the sun's light is fueling this process, okay? So as long as there's sun's light, these things are going to continue to make ATP. It's just the way it is, okay? And so these high energy electrons pass through the electron transport chain, and they make ATP as a result, okay? So where do the electrons go from there? They then enter photosystem 1. Okay, photosystem 1 is the second photosystem that we see in this process. Okay, it comes second. So at this point, what we just discussed is that the high energy electrons are passed through the electron transport chain. They work their way through the electron transport chain to make ATP, and this just happens indefinitely. As long as there's sunlight, we're just making infinite amounts of this. Well, I should say, as long as there's sunlight and water, right? We're making infinite amounts of ATP as long as those two things are there. So at that point, the electron transport chain, or the electrons work their way through that chain, and they are actually then passed directly to photosystem 1. And they sit in photosystem 1's chlorophyll A. That's what we see right here. Let me get rid of this. This right here is chlorophyll A of photosystem 1. And those electrons sit there. Now, at this point, they've lost some energy, right? In their travels through the electron transport chain, they've lost some energy. That's what we see here. That's why this is higher, like physically in the picture is higher than it is here. This is a visual reminder that these electrons have lost energy on their way down to photosystem 1, okay? And they use that energy to make ATP, all right? So at this point, the electrons are then low energy again. They need to be energized a second time, and that's what we see happen here. Photons of light are accepted by the plant pigments, and in photosystem 1, those photons of light are at 700 nanometers, okay? So those 700 nanometer photons are bounced through these pigment molecules until they ultimately reach chlorophyll A, and those photons of light are then going to excite the electrons to a higher energy state, where they are held by the primary electron acceptor in that excited state, okay? Now, what do we think is going to happen again? Well, in the next phase, we're going to send them through yet another electron transport chain, okay? But in this instance, we are not going to make ATP. We're going to send them through this electron transport chain, and we are going to make something called NADPH. And the H is actually, it should be there, but formatting errors of Google Slides have caused it to switch up. So let me take a picture here. And this picture is not going to be anything revolutionary, but at this point here in this final step of the light reactions, we have these electrons that are held in that higher energy state by the primary electron acceptor. They are passed through a second electron transport chain, and they end up in a molecule called NADPH. Now, NADPH is almost identical in function to NADH. Okay, if you remember what NADH was an electron carrier in cell respiration. It took that high energy electron and it carried it to a place where it could be used. Okay, and that's exactly what we see here. We see these electrons, which started off in these photosystems, right? And they're going through this electron transport chain to kind of harness some of their energy, and they end up in NADPH, okay? End up in NADPH. So that is the process of the light reactions. That's what happens in the light reactions to help us to harness the sun's energy, excite the electrons. We're making some ATP as a result, and then we are packaging up those still high energy electrons into an electron carrier called NADPH. Okay, so before we go on to the next bit of information, because I'm going to kind of leave you hanging here, I want to show you the thylakoid, kind of like at a zoomed out view of what happens at the thylakoid. And in this picture here, we can see photosystem 2, and we can see photosystem 1, and we can see how all of this kind of comes together, and we can then see how we make the ATP. I said that the high energy electrons here at this point were actually going to be passed down an electron transport chain, right? And that's what we see here. And I said that when that happens, we use the energy of those electrons to pump H plus into the thylakoid space. There's a big buildup of H plus. This is a highly acidic area right here. Big buildup of H plus in the thylakoid space. That big buildup is then run down its concentration gradient through ATP synthase, through ATP synthase to make ATP. Again, that's infinite as long as we have sunlight and water. And those electrons work their way through to photosystem 1, where they kind of hang out here in the chlorophyll A. More light is harvested. They get bumped up to a higher energy level. The electrons are passed down another electron transport chain and ultimately end up in NADPH. Okay? Now, the products of these light reactions, the NADPH and the ATP, both end up in the next phase of photosynthesis, which is called the Calvin cycle, also known as the dark reactions, because they don't actually need light to occur. Okay, because we are taking the process or the products of the light reactions, ATP and NADPH, and we're going to have them enter this new cycle. And they're going to be utilized in a special way then to make sugar. Okay? So, this process that we just talked about has another name, and I will only, pardon me, bring this up, this process, this new name of this process, up because we're going to look into a derivative process in the next phase. This is also known as non-cyclic photophosphorylation, and this term refers to the pathway of the electrons through the process. Okay, I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock into memorizing, like going crazy into memorizing how this, why they call this non-cyclic photophosphorylation, but it's called non-cyclic because you start with some electrons that are produced by water here, and they have a path. They go here, and they come down here, and then they go up here, and then they end up in NADPH. There is no cycle for these electrons. In another process that we're going to learn called cyclic photophosphorylation, there is a pathway for the electrons where they continue in a cycle, and they just continue to be almost recycled through this process over and over again. Whereas in this process, non-cyclic photophosphorylation, they have a start point here, and they ultimately have an end point in NADPH where they end up. Okay, so I only introduced that here because we're going to talk more specifically about a derivative of that process called cyclic photophosphorylation. All right, this is just another graphic. If you like this, I used to do something with this. We're not going to do it right now, but it depicts working men, and I think maybe there's a woman in there. I think that's a ponytail. I shouldn't stereotype that way. But anyway, this is an old PowerPoint picture. But working men and women to show how you can use photons of light to energize the electrons, how they're passed down these different chains, and what they ultimately create and where they ultimately end up. If you like it, great, use it. I'll leave it in there. Okay? So let's just do a quick review. Where does photosystem 1 get its electrons? See if you can answer this. Pause the video. Photosystem 1 gets its electrons from photosystem 2. Okay, go back and check the diagrams and the explanations if you don't believe me. Where does photosystem 2 get its electrons? Photosystem 2 gets its electrons from water. What is the product of non-cyclic photophosphorylation? I should have said products. They are ATP and NADPH. Again, they are produced indefinitely unless there is no more sunlight or water. All of these products, ATP and NADPH, are then taken to the next phase of photosynthesis called the Calvin cycle. All right. So this puts into perspective the two phases that we are going to study. We just got done looking at this one, the light reactions, right? Where light is harvested with the use of electrons from H2O. We get the products of ATP and NADPH and a byproduct of oxygen. Okay? These products, ATP and NADPH, are then taken to the stroma, which is the space, and you can kind of see that out here, taken to the space that kind of surrounds all of the thylakoids, and they enter a second cycle, or a second phase, called the Calvin cycle, also known as the dark reactions. And in the Calvin cycle, these things here, ATP and NADPH, along with CO2 from the atmosphere, are used to make sugar molecules. And so that is the next phase that we're going to talk about in the next video. Before we do that, I would like to show you some of the, in my opinion, useful animations that are shown here that I always like to show because I don't think you can get them. I don't know if your computers use the Adobe Flash anymore. Mine, for whatever reason, still supports it. So I'll go ahead and run through these, and I'll keep it up so that you can actually see what's going on. Okay, so let's replay.
Two photosystems, two electron transport chains, and ATP synthase are the key components of the light reactions of photosynthesis. These parts are embedded in the thylakoid membranes of a chloroplast. Select the correct label for each part from each pull-down menu.
Okay, so I think this is something I will review in live. This is always a fun thing to just call on people, get people interactive. But if you watch the video in its entirety, you'll have a one-up, you'll have a little cheat sheet. So pause it now and see if you can't look at this diagram. I'm going to go ahead and don't pause it just yet, but these are your choices, okay? So if you paused it right after I'm done talking, you'd have some choices to pick from. See if you can't identify what each one of these structures is that they're pointing to based on the choices that they give you here, okay? So go ahead and pause the video if you'd like and see if you can identify them, but I'm going to go ahead and identify them all right now. The first one that we see right here is Photosystem 2, which connects to Photosystem 1, so this is Photosystem 1, and they are connected by an electron transport chain. After Photosystem 1, these proteins indicate yet another electron transport chain. Okay? This yellow substance inside of the thylakoid is this. Where is it? The thylakoid compartment. That's right. And this right here is the thylakoid membrane. There it is, thylakoid membrane, which has embedded into it ATP synthase. Okay, this outside area, this orange area, is called the stroma. All right, so now we have kind of our bearings. We know what we're looking at, and we can kind of follow along in these next animations a little bit more appropriately.
The photosystems consist of arrays of chlorophyll molecules. Chlorophyll, the green pigment of leaves, absorbs light energy. The absorbed energy excites electrons to a higher energy level. Energized electrons from photosystem 1 are passed down an electron transport chain and added to NADP+ to form NADPH. Meanwhile, energized electrons from photosystem 2 are passed through another electron transport chain. Their energy is used to pump hydrogen ions from the stroma into the thylakoid compartment, creating a concentration gradient. Electrons leaving this electron transport chain enter photosystem 1, replenishing its lost electrons. Photosystem 2 replenishes its electrons by splitting water. Hydrogen ions and oxygen are released into the thylakoid compartment. This is where the oxygen gas generated by photosynthesis comes from. The photosystems consist of arrays of chlorophyll molecules. Chlorophyll, the green pigment of leaves, absorbs light energy. The absorbed energy excites electrons to a higher energy level. Energized electrons from photosystem 1 are passed down an electron transport chain and added to NADP+ to form NADPH. Meanwhile, energized electrons from photosystem 2 are passed through another electron transport chain. Their energy is used to pump hydrogen ions from the stroma into the thylakoid compartment, creating a concentration gradient. Electrons leaving this electron transport chain enter photosystem 1, replenishing its lost electrons. Photosystem 2 replenishes its electrons by splitting water. Hydrogen ions and oxygen are released into the thylakoid compartment. This is where the oxygen gas generated by photosynthesis comes from.
Okay, so there was an error. You just watched all that twice. Let's see if I can get...
The photosystem,
I just saw that.
the buildup of
All right,
hydrogen ions inside the thylakoid compartment stores potential energy. This energy is harvested by an enzyme called ATP synthase. As hydrogen ions diffuse through ATP synthase down their concentration gradient, the enzyme uses the energy of the moving ions to make ATP. Next, ATP and NADPH are used in the sugar-making process of the Calvin cycle.
All right, so aside from that little hiccup we had, you've seen basically everything that I just talked about. Now you've seen it in motion. It should make a little bit more sense when you can take this picture here that you see and compare it to the pictures that have been in the notes and the PowerPoint to give you a better understanding of just what I've been talking about, okay? Because it is a relatively in-depth process, and it's one of those ones that I think you benefit from if you can have a moving picture inside of your head. Now, one of the things I would like you guys to do is to try to go back and maybe just have this picture in front of you, maybe the picture that you see in front of you here or some of the diagrams that are in the slideshow, and just have it in front of you and see if you can narrate it either like I did, or narrate it like the guy in the animation you just saw. Okay, I think that's going to be a very valuable study tool. Okay, so we got one more video left, and that is going to be on the Calvin cycle. So we're going to complete the story of sugar production in the plants very soon. Have a good one, guys.